Early morning in Sitka, Alaska. The kind of morning where fog doesn't lift so much as it relocates, sliding between spruce trees like something alive, something watchful. The air tastes of salt and wet wood. On the corner of Lincoln and Monastery Streets, a two-story structure painted in faded ochre yellow rises from the mist, its red metal roof dark with rain. This is the Russian bishop's house. From certain angles, in certain light, it looks almost cheerful. A museum now. Tourists come here to learn about Russian America, to see the icons and the carefully preserved rooms, to feel like they've touched history, but walk the perimeter. Notice the joinery where Finnish carpenters fitted spruce logs together without nails in 1842. Notice the thickness of the walls, built not just against Alaska's cold, but against something harder to name. This building was the administrative heart of an empire's religious mission, a diocese stretching from the coast of California to the frozen shores of Kamchatka in Siberia. 9,000 miles of coastline, hundreds of islands, tens of thousands of indigenous people, all overseen from this 42 by 63-foot structure by bishops who answered to a czar 6,000 miles away in St. Petersburg. Inside those walls, men spoke of salvation. Outside, in hunting grounds and trading posts scattered across the North Pacific, the Russian-American company conducted business that would kill 80% of the Aleut population within 2 generations. Sea otter pelts purchased with hostages, furs traded for lives. The wealth that built this house, that paid for the icons shipped from Russia, and the education of indigenous children, and the translation of scripture into native languages, all of it stained with a blood price that no sermon could wash clean. When Russia sold Alaska to the United States for $7.2 million in 1867, the transaction took place in Sitka, within sight of this building. The Russian flag came down. The American flag went up. The bishop's house lost its empire overnight, but remained stubborn and physical, slowly rotting through decades of neglect until 1969, when the last bishop moved out and left it to collapse. The National Park Service spent 16 years restoring it to how it looked in 1853, the year it symbolized power and permanence and God's will manifested in spruce and iron. But here's the question nobody asks in the guided tours. When you restore a building to its glory days, what exactly are you glorifying? The faith of the men who lived here, or the system that paid for it? The missionary who translated the gospel into Aleut? Or the company that enslaved Aleut hunters to finance the mission? The preservation of culture, or the preservation of a lie we tell ourselves about how empires work? Love uncovering the troubling stories behind America's preserved landmarks? Then like this video, subscribe and comment with which historic property funded by exploitation you want me to explore next, whether it's a mansion, mission, or estate. Every like helps bring these investigations to light. Thanks for watching. Let's begin. The story begins, as so many colonial stories do, with distance. Distance not just as geography, but as a kind of moral insulation. A space between cause and effect that lets people do terrible things because the consequences happen somewhere else, to someone else, far enough away that you never have to look them in the eye. In 1741, Vitus Bering's second Kamchatka expedition made landfall on the coast of what would become Alaska. The expedition was the culmination of nearly 2 decades of planning and investment by the Russian government, part of a broader effort to map the northern Pacific and determine whether Asia and America were connected by land. Bering was Danish, recruited by Peter the Great to lead expeditions into the unknown reaches of Russia's eastern frontier. His first expedition in 1728 had sailed through the strait that now bears his name, but hadn't actually sighted the American continent due to fog and caution. The second expedition was meant to complete the work, and it did, after a fashion. The ship sailed from Kamchatka in June 1741, heading east into waters where European vessels had never gone. They made landfall on what's now called Kayak Island in July, stayed less than a day, then began the return journey as autumn weather closed in. Storms separated the 2 ships. Scurvy ravaged the crews. Bering's vessel, the St. Peter, was wrecked on one of the Commander Islands in November. Bering himself died there in December, along with 30 of his crew. The survivors, 46 men, spent a brutal winter on the island, hunting sea otters and seals to survive. Living in shelters they dug into the frozen ground. When they finally limped back to Kamchatka in August 1742, they brought news of the expedition's discoveries. But more importantly, they brought furs. Hundreds of sea otter pelts, along with furs from foxes and seals, all harvested from an island where the animals had never learned to fear humans. The furs were extraordinarily valuable. A single sea otter pelt could sell for enough money to support a working family for months. The Chinese market was insatiable for them, prizing them above even sable. Word spread fast among Russian fur traders and adventurers. Within a year, the first Promyshleniki expeditions were heading east from Siberia, racing each other to claim the richest hunting grounds. This was the beginning, not the beginning of Russian presence in the region. Indigenous peoples had lived there for 10,000 years, and there had been sporadic contact with Russian traders even earlier. But it was the beginning of systematic exploitation, the moment when Alaska stopped being an abstract concept on a map and became a resource to be extracted. The race was on. By 1743, Russian Promyshleniki, freelance fur traders essentially, though the term translates more accurately as frontiersmen with business interests and carries connotations of rough men doing rough work far from the oversight of civilization, began sailing from Siberian ports to the Aleutian Islands. These weren't explorers in the romantic sense. They weren't scientists or cartographers or adventurers seeking glory. They were entrepreneurs with muskets and a keen understanding that fortunes could be made if you didn't worry too much about who got hurt in the process. And a lot of people got hurt. The Promyshleniki operated on a business model that would be familiar to anyone who understands extractive colonialism. They formed small partnerships called artels, pooling resources to outfit a ship and hire a crew. The investors, often merchants in Siberian cities like Irkutsk or Yakutsk, provided capital. The crew provided labor. Everyone understood that the expedition was gambling on finding rich hunting grounds and getting back alive. The risks were substantial: storms, scurvy, shipwreck, conflict with indigenous peoples, navigation errors in uncharted waters. But the potential rewards were extraordinary. A successful expedition could return with enough furs to make everyone rich. An unsuccessful one could cost everyone their lives. The key to success was finding hunting grounds where sea otters were abundant and where the local population could be controlled. This second factor was crucial. Sea otters are notoriously difficult to hunt. They're wary animals, quick in the water, able to dive deep and stay under for minutes at a time. Hunting them effectively requires intimate knowledge of their behavior, specialized equipment, and skills that take years to develop. The Promyshleniki, most of them from Siberia, didn't have those skills, but they didn't need them because the Aleut people did. The Aleut people had inhabited the chain of volcanic islands stretching between mainland Alaska and Kamchatka for thousands of years. The Aleutian Islands are not hospitable territory. They're cold, windy, foggy, subject to storms that can turn deadly without warning. Earthquakes are common, tsunamis happen, fresh water is scarce, trees don't grow. But the Aleuts had adapted to these conditions with extraordinary sophistication. They were maritime hunters, masters of the kayak, or as they called it, the aikyaks. They hunted sea otters, seals, sea lions, whales. They fished. They gathered birds and eggs from the cliffs. They developed waterproof clothing from sea mammal intestines, intricate harpoons and lances, techniques for hunting in conditions that would kill a novice within hours, which made them extremely useful to Russians who couldn't hunt sea otters themselves but knew where the market was. The Promyshleniki developed a simple system, refined through trial and error in the 1740s and 1750s. When they arrived at an island, they would assess the local population. If the community was small and isolated, they'd simply demand tribute in furs, backed by the threat of violence from firearms that the Aleuts didn't possess. If the community was larger or more resistant, they'd employ a more sophisticated method: take women and children hostage, send the men out to hunt, and hold the hostages until sufficient furs had been delivered. If the hunters didn't return with enough pelts, execute some hostages to motivate the others. On Attu Island in 1763, 15 women and children were killed as an example. This wasn't some rogue operation. This was how business worked. The system was so effective that by 1799, when Tsar Paul I granted a monopoly charter to the newly formed Russian-American company, forced labor was already built into the economic model. The RAC wasn't just a trading company, it was a quasi-governmental entity with the power to establish settlements, conduct foreign policy, and administer justice. In practice, this meant the company could do whatever it wanted, as long as it turned a profit and paid its debts to the crown. And what it wanted was furs, millions of them, harvested by indigenous labor that cost nothing but the ammunition needed to keep people compliant. The mathematics were brutal but simple. Sea otters, once abundant, began to decline rapidly under systematic hunting pressure. The RAC responded by expanding its operations, moving eastward from the Aleutians to Kodiak Island, then to the mainland, always searching for new hunting grounds, new populations of animals to exploit, new populations of people to coerce into doing the work. By 1804, the company had established its colonial capital at Sitka, then called New Archangel, after violently suppressing Tlingit resistance. The Tlingit, unlike the more isolated Aleats, fought back with sophisticated military tactics and refused to accept Russian dominance. It didn't matter. The company had cannons and a mandate from the Tsar. Here's what the numbers looked like. In 1741, when Bering's expedition first made contact, roughly 100,000 indigenous people lived in what would become Russian Alaska. 17,000 of them were Aleats living on the Aleutian Islands and the Alaska Peninsula. 50 years later, the Aleut population had dropped to around 1,500, 80% dead. The primary killers were diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, to which the Aleuts had no immunity. But disease doesn't spread itself. Disease travels with people, and the people who brought it were the same people who were forcing Aleut hunters into kayaks and out onto frigid water for weeks at a time. The same people who were taking hostages and executing them and destroying hunting equipment and boats to ensure compliance. When you systematically weaken a population through forced labor and stress and separation from their families and communities, disease becomes a weapon whether you intend it or not. The Russian Orthodox Church watched all of this happen. In the early days, priests who came to Alaska with the fur traders were often complicit in the exploitation, blessing ships before they departed on hunting expeditions, baptizing indigenous people without their full understanding, serving as chaplains to an economic system that treated human beings as tools. But the church also had men who objected. Starting with the arrival of the first formal mission in 1794, some Orthodox clergy began documenting the abuses and writing reports back to Russia about what was actually happening in the colony. The problem was distance. A letter from Alaska to St. Petersburg took months to deliver, and by the time anyone in the capital read about atrocities in the Aleutians, those atrocities were already history, and the Russian-American company was making money. And money, then as now, had a way of making people look the other way. In 1821, Tsar Alexander I renewed the RAC's monopoly charter with a new requirement. The company had to provide financial support to the Russian Orthodox Church in Alaska. This wasn't charity. This was strategy. The Tsar understood that if Russia wanted to maintain its claim to this territory, especially with British and American traders encroaching on the region, it needed more than trading posts. It needed settlers, schools, churches. It needed the infrastructure of permanent occupation. The church could provide that infrastructure. The church could learn native languages, translate scripture, establish schools, create a generation of indigenous people who identified as Orthodox Christians and therefore as subjects of the Russian Empire. It was colonialism with a cross on top, and it required money, which the RAC had, and justification, which the church could supply. This is the context in which the Russian bishop's house was built. In 1840, a priest named Ivan Veniaminov was called back from Alaska to St. Petersburg. He had spent 16 years in Alaska, first on Unalaska Island in the Aleutians, then in Sitka. During that time, he had learned 6 indigenous languages and dialects. He had created a Cyrillic alphabet for the Unangan Aleut language. He had translated the Gospel of Matthew and other religious texts. He had built churches and schools. He had traveled thousands of miles by kayak and sailing ship, conducting services, performing baptisms, teaching children. By all accounts, he genuinely cared about the people he worked with. The Aleuts called him their defender because he spoke up against the worst excesses of the company, writing letters to Russian authorities describing the forced labor and the hostage-taking and the conditions that were killing so many people. While Veniaminov was in St. Petersburg reporting on his work and requesting more support for the Alaska mission, his wife died. As a widower, he became eligible under Orthodox canon law to become a bishop. The church offered him leadership of a newly created diocese that would encompass an area larger than most European countries. Kamchatka in Siberia, the Kuril Islands, all of the Aleutian Islands, the Alaska Peninsula, and the Alexander Archipelago where Sitka sat. Veniaminov accepted. He took the monastic name Innocent and returned to Alaska in September 1841 as Bishop of Kamchatka and the Aleutians. He was 44 years old. He would serve in Alaska for another 9 years before being transferred to Yakutsk in Siberia, where his diocese expanded even further. Eventually, in 1868, he would become Metropolitan of Moscow, the highest ecclesiastical position in the Russian Orthodox Church. He died in 1879 and was canonized as a saint in 1977. But in 1841, arriving back in Sitka as the new bishop, Innocent needed a house. Not just a residence, but an administrative center for a diocese that stretched across 9,000 miles of coastline, a place where he could work on translations, train new clergy, house visiting priests and monks, run a school, maintain the records of baptisms and marriages and deaths that were required both by the church and by the colonial administration. The Russian-American company, obligated by its charter to support the church, agreed to fund construction. The house was built between 1841 and 1843, a timeline that tells its own story about the difficulty of construction in this environment. 2 years to build a moderately sized log house might seem long by modern standards, but consider what was involved. Every log had to be cut from the forest, dragged to the construction site, stripped of bark, squared by hand with adzes and axes, measured and marked for joinery, fitted into place. The Finnish carpenters who did this work were masters of a tradition that went back centuries in Northern Europe, where building with timber meant understanding how wood moves as it dries, how different tree species behave, how to create joints that would hold for generations without metal fasteners. The design was Russian vernacular architecture adapted to Alaska's specific climate conditions. A 2-story log structure made from spruce trees cut from the surrounding forest, 42 feet wide by 63 feet deep, divided into 9 bays. Each bay measured 1 sajan, an old Russian unit of length equal to about 7 feet, roughly the span of a man's outstretched arms. This was intentional standardization, allowing for systematic construction where each section could be built similarly. The logs were squared rather than rounded, a technique that provided more stability and better weather resistance than round log construction. Squared logs fit together more tightly, leaving fewer gaps for air and water to penetrate. They also stack more efficiently, making the walls straighter and stronger. The joinery techniques used were sophisticated, representing centuries of accumulated knowledge about how to build structures that could withstand cold, damp earthquakes and the inevitable settling that occurs as green timber dries. Corner notching was done with precision, each log shaped to lock into the ones below and above it. The notches weren't simple half-laps. They were carefully designed interlocking joints that would tighten as the wood dried rather than loosening. Wooden pegs were used in some places to prevent lateral movement, but the structure relied primarily on the weight of the logs themselves and the precision of the joinery to maintain integrity. The craftsmanship was Finnish. This wasn't accidental or incidental. Finland was part of the Russian Empire from 1809 to 1917, annexed by Russia after centuries of Swedish rule. Finnish shipwrights and carpenters were prized throughout the Russian Empire for their expertise in working with northern timber. They understood spruce and pine and birch intimately. They knew how to select trees, how to fell them at the right time of year when sap content was optimal for construction, how to work the wood while it was still green enough to be shaped easily, but dry enough not to warp excessively later. They brought this knowledge to Alaska. The RAC regularly recruited Finnish workers because the company needed skilled labor for its shipyard in Sitka. Building and maintaining ships in Alaska was crucial to the company's operations. Ships brought supplies from Russia, transported furs to market, carried company personnel up and down the coast. The shipyard needed carpenters, blacksmiths, sailmakers, rope makers, all the specialized trades required to keep a fleet operational. Finnish workers were offered contracts, passage to Alaska, wages, accommodation. What many of them didn't realize until they arrived was that Alaska was far more remote and difficult than they'd been led to believe, and that getting back to Finland if they wanted to leave was nearly impossible. They were, in effect, contract laborers with little recourse if conditions weren't what they'd been promised. These Finnish laborers, brought to Sitka to work in the company's shipyard, were now tasked with building a house for a bishop. It was prestigious work in some respects, a major structure for an important client. But it was also just another job for men who were far from home and probably wondering if they'd ever see Finland again. They applied their craft with the same attention to detail they'd bring to any job, because that's what craftsmanship means. You do it right regardless of the circumstances. The joints they cut, the logs they shaped, the structure they erected, all of it was built to last, and it has lasted for more than 180 years now, testimony to the skill of workers whose names we don't even know. The exterior was eventually sheathed in clapboard siding and painted ochre yellow, a color that would have stood out against the green of the forest and the gray of the frequent rain. The ochre yellow wasn't just aesthetic. It was a pigment that provided some protection against moisture and rot. The paint itself was probably imported from Russia or purchased from American trading ships, mixed on site with oil and applied in multiple coats. The roof was metal, painted red to prevent rust. Metal roofing was expensive but necessary in Alaska's climate, where wooden shingles would rot quickly under constant exposure to rain and snow. The metal was likely copper or iron, shaped into sheets and fastened to the roof structure with nails and sealant. The red paint wasn't just decorative, it was lead-based paint that provided a protective coating against oxidation. Galleries ran along the east and west sides of the building, covered walkways that provided outdoor access between rooms, and would later be enclosed with board and batten siding. These galleries served multiple functions. In good weather, they were pleasant places to walk or sit, catching what sun was available. In bad weather, they provided protected passage between different parts of the building without having to go through interior rooms. They also created an air gap between the outside wall and the interior spaces, adding thermal insulation. In later renovations, around 1887, the galleries were fully enclosed with vertical board and batten siding, creating additional usable space and improving thermal performance. Inside, the house was divided into spaces for different functions. The first floor held workshops where church materials could be produced or repaired, storage areas for supplies that needed to be kept dry, and rooms for church activities and education. This was where the school operated, where visiting priests might stay temporarily, where church records were stored, where meetings were held. The layout was practical rather than grand, designed for work rather than display. The second floor was the bishop's living quarters, bedroom, study, dining room, and most importantly, a small chapel dedicated to the Annunciation. These spaces reflected the dual nature of a bishop's role, part administrator, part spiritual leader, part household manager. The study was where Innocent would work on his translations, spending hours puzzling over how to express theological concepts in languages that had never had words for them. The bedroom was modest, equipped with simple furniture and few luxuries. The dining room was where meals were taken and where visitors might be entertained. Orthodox bishops were expected to practice hospitality, welcoming travelers and providing food and lodging to priests and church officials passing through. This chapel was the spiritual heart of the house. It was modest compared to the grand cathedrals of Russia, but it was carefully appointed with icons shipped from St. Petersburg, vestments, liturgical vessels, everything needed to conduct Orthodox services. The icons weren't just decorative. They were windows into the divine, representations of Christ and the Virgin Mary, and the saints that were meant to bring the presence of the sacred into the room. For Innocent and the priests who served under him, this chapel was where they could pray before embarking on missionary journeys that might take months, traveling by boat to remote villages, living in conditions that ranged from uncomfortable to dangerous, trying to spread a faith that many indigenous people accepted, because refusing meant risking the anger of the company that controlled access to trade goods and could make life very difficult for people who didn't cooperate. The house functioned as Innocent intended. He used it as a base for administering his enormous diocese, organizing missionary work, training indigenous clergy, running a school that taught children in both Russian and their native languages. He worked on his translations here, producing religious texts in Aleut and Tlingit. He wrote letters to Russian authorities advocating for better treatment of indigenous people and complaining about the company's practices. He hosted visiting clergy and church officials. When American ships began appearing in Alaskan waters with increasing frequency, he was the one who had to navigate the political complications of living in a territory that Russia was starting to realize it couldn't hold forever. But there's a tension at the center of this story that's impossible to ignore. Innocent was a sincere man trying to do good work within a system built on exploitation. He opposed the worst abuses of the RAC. He documented them, he wrote about them, but he also accepted funding from the company to build his house and his schools. He baptized indigenous people into a church that served the same empire that was destroying their communities. He translated scripture into languages spoken by people whose relatives had been taken hostage or killed or worked to death, hunting furs that enriched Russian merchants and shareholders. You can be genuinely compassionate and still be complicit in a larger crime. History is full of people like that. The question is whether the good they did outweighs the harm they enabled, and that's a calculation with no clear answer. Here are some numbers to put this in perspective. By the 1840s, when the Bishop's House was being built, the Russian-American company operated approximately 40 trading posts across Alaska. Sitka, the colonial capital, had a permanent population of around 900 people, mostly Russians and Creoles, mixed-race descendants of Russian men and indigenous women. The company employed thousands of indigenous hunters and laborers, most of them working under coercive conditions that ranged from low wages and debt peonage to outright slavery. The church ran 43 parish schools across Alaska by the 1880s, educating children in Orthodox Christianity and Russian language, and sometimes their native languages. The Diocese of Kamchatka and the Aleutians, headquartered in the Bishop's House, covered roughly 9,000 miles of coastline and was responsible for the spiritual welfare of tens of thousands of people, most of whom lived in small, isolated communities accessible only by boat. The wealth flowing out of Alaska was substantial but declining. By the 1840s and 1850s, sea otter populations had been hunted to near extinction. The company was making less money and maintaining the colony was becoming more expensive. Russia was also dealing with geopolitical pressures. The Crimean War from 1853 to 1856 was a disaster for the Russian Empire, draining the treasury and exposing military weaknesses. The British were encroaching on Russian interests in the Pacific, leasing a southern portion of Alaska from the RAC and establishing Fort Stikine in 1839, siphoning off trade. American traders and whalers were increasingly common in Alaskan waters. The Russian government began to consider the possibility that Alaska wasn't worth the cost of defending it, especially if a future war with Britain meant that the British Navy could easily seize the territory. In 1867, after years of informal discussions, the United States and Russia concluded negotiations for the sale of Alaska. Secretary of State William Seward and Russian Minister to the United States Eduard de Stukal signed the treaty on March 30, 1867, after an all-night bargaining session. The price was $7.2 million, which worked out to about 2 cents per acre. The Senate ratified the treaty in April. The House of Representatives, angry that it hadn't been consulted before the treaty was signed, delayed funding for more than a year, but eventually appropriated the money. The formal transfer took place in Sitka on October 18, 1867. That ceremony happened within sight of the Bishop's House. Russian soldiers and American soldiers paraded in front of the governor's mansion. The Russian flag was lowered. Cannons fired salutes. The American flag was raised. Alaska was now American territory. Most of the Russians who had been living in Sitka left shortly after. They had no reason to stay. The economic system they'd been part of was over. The Russian-American company was dissolved. The infrastructure of Russian colonialism, the trading posts, the administrative buildings, the networks of debt and obligation that had connected Sitka to St. Petersburg, all of it was dismantled or transferred to American control. But the Bishop's House remained. The Russian Orthodox Church didn't dissolve just because the territory changed hands. There were still thousands of Orthodox Christians in Alaska, most of them indigenous people who had been baptized during the decades of Russian rule. They still needed priests, still wanted church services, still practiced a faith that was now their own, even if it had originally been imposed. The church continued to function, though its circumstances changed dramatically. In 1870, the diocese headquarters moved from Sitka to San Francisco, which made more sense given that Alaska was now American and most Orthodox Christians in North America lived in the continental United States. But the bishop's house in Sitka continued to serve as a residence for clergy and as a center for church activities in Alaska. The school continued to operate, teaching Orthodox Christianity and basic education. The chapel continued to hold services. Priests came and went. Bishops visited occasionally. The building aged. Then came 1917. The year began ominously in Russia, with food shortages and strikes in Petrograd. By March, the Tsar had abdicated. The provisional government that replaced him lasted only months before the Bolsheviks seized power in October. What followed was civil war, famine, terror. The Russian Revolution toppled more than a monarchy. It dismantled an entire social and economic order that had existed for centuries. The Orthodox Church, which had functioned as a department of the Russian government since Peter the Great, suddenly found itself in the crosshairs of a regime that viewed religion as the opium of the people and saw the church as an ally of the old regime. Church property was confiscated. Priests were arrested. When Patriarch Tikhon, who had served as Bishop of Alaska and North America from 1898 to 1907, before being recalled to Russia, resisted the confiscations, he was imprisoned from 1922 to 1923. The persecution was systematic and brutal. Thousands of clergy were executed or sent to labor camps. Churches were closed or converted to secular uses. Icons were destroyed or sold abroad to raise currency. The millennium-old relationship between the Russian state and the Orthodox Church was severed with violence. For the Russian Orthodox Church in America, including Alaska, the impact was immediate and catastrophic. The Imperial Missionary Society, which had been providing funding for Orthodox churches, schools, and missions across North America since the 1820s, stopped all payments overnight. There was no transition, no warning, no gradual reduction. The checks simply stopped coming. Churches that had depended on Russian subsidies to pay clergy salaries, maintain buildings, and operate schools suddenly had no income beyond what they could raise from their own parishioners, many of whom were poor themselves. In Alaska, where the Orthodox Church had been a major presence for more than a century, the collapse of funding was devastating. The church had operated 43 parish schools as of the 1880s, educating thousands of Alaska Native children. Those schools required teachers, supplies, buildings, heating fuel. Without funding from Russia, most of them couldn't continue. The school in the bishop's house, which had been training clergy and educating children since the building was constructed, closed in 1922. The territory of Alaska took over the schoolhouse next door to the bishop's house and used it as a public school. But the church-run education system that had been such a major part of Orthodox presence in Alaska essentially ended. Parishes tried to adapt. Some went on hiatus, holding services only when a traveling priest could visit. Some relied on lay leaders to maintain a minimal presence. Some merged with neighboring parishes to consolidate resources. Priests who had been receiving stipends from the Imperial Missionary Society either found other work or simply left Alaska. The diocesan administration, which had moved from Sitka to San Francisco in 1870 and then to New York in 1905, struggled to maintain oversight over Alaska with no resources to support its work there. An auxiliary bishop for Alaska had been consecrated in 1903, but after 1917, funding that position became impossible. Alaska was too far away, too sparsely populated, too expensive to administer without subsidies. The bishop's house itself, magnificent when it was new and still imposing in 1917, began its long decline. Wood buildings in Alaska's climate require constant maintenance, painting to protect against moisture, roof repairs to prevent leaks, foundation work to address settling and water damage, window maintenance, floor repairs. All of that costs money that the church no longer had. Minor problems, a small leak in the roof, a bit of rot in one log, became major problems when they couldn't be addressed promptly. Water infiltration led to more rot. Rot weakened structural members. The building's problems compounded. Wood in Alaska's climate requires constant maintenance. Rain and fog and freezing and thawing take their toll. The spruce logs that Finnish carpenters had fitted together so carefully in the 1840s started to rot where moisture collected. The metal roof developed leaks. Water damage spread through the structure. Floors began to sag. Doorways tilted. Paint peeled. By the 1960s, the house was in serious trouble. It was still being used as a residence, but it was increasingly clear that the building was approaching the end of its functional life. In 1969, the last bishop living in the house moved out. The Russian Orthodox Church didn't have the money to restore it, and the building was dangerous. The walls were rotting. The roof was failing. Without major intervention, the house would collapse within a few years. For a while, it sat vacant, slowly deteriorating. Another old building in Alaska that had outlived its purpose and was waiting to fall down. But the bishop's house had one thing going for it: historical significance. This was one of only 3 buildings from the Russian colonial period still standing in Alaska. It was a National Historic Landmark, designated in 1962. It was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in 1966. That meant something. It meant that preservationists and historians and government officials recognized that this building represented a piece of American history that couldn't be replaced if it was lost. Russian America was a short-lived empire, only 126 years from Bering's expedition in 1741 to the sale in 1867. But it had shaped Alaska in profound ways. The Orthodox Church was still a major presence in Alaska Native communities. The cultural legacy of Russian colonialism was everywhere. Place names, language borrowings, religious practices, family lineages, and most of the physical structures that could tell that story were gone, destroyed by fire or decay or deliberate demolition. The National Park Service decided to act. In 1973, recognizing that this was one of only 3 surviving buildings from the Russian colonial period in Alaska, and that it represented an irreplaceable piece of American history, the agency purchased the bishop's house and the surrounding property, incorporating it into Sitka National Historical Park. What followed was one of the most ambitious and technically complex restoration projects the Park Service had undertaken at that time. The goal wasn't just to repair the building, but to restore it to its 1853 appearance, the year when Innocent was still in residence and the house was at the height of its function as the center of Russian Orthodox activity in Alaska. This meant more than just fixing what was broken. It meant researching exactly what the house had looked like during that specific period, tracking down original construction documents in archives in Alaska and Russia, studying photographs from various periods to understand how the building had changed over time, interviewing elderly residents of Sitka who remembered the building before later alterations, examining the structure itself for evidence of original features that had been covered or modified. The restoration took 16 years, from 1973 to 1989. That's longer than it took to build the house in the first place, but the work was painstaking and complicated in ways that new construction never is. When you're building new, you can make decisions based on what's convenient or what materials are available. When you're restoring to a specific historical period, you have to match original materials and techniques as closely as possible while also meeting modern building codes and making the structure accessible and safe for public visitation. The first challenge was structural stabilization. By 1973, when the Park Service acquired the building, it was in danger of collapse. The foundation had settled unevenly, causing walls to lean and floors to slope. Water infiltration over decades had caused extensive rot in the lower logs and the floor joists. The roof was failing in multiple places, allowing water to damage interior spaces. Stabilization meant jacking up sections of the building, replacing the foundation where necessary, removing and replacing rotted logs, reinforcing structural members that had weakened, and waterproofing the entire structure. Replacing logs was particularly challenging because it had to be done in a way that matched the original construction. The Park Service couldn't just buy dimensional lumber and cut it to size. They had to source spruce logs, similar to what would have been available in the 1840s, square them using period-appropriate techniques, shape the joinery to match the original, and fit them into place without disrupting the rest of the structure. Each replaced log had to be documented: which one it was replacing, why replacement was necessary, what the original log had looked like, how the new log was prepared. This documentation was essential both for historical accuracy and for future maintenance. The roof presented its own challenges. The original roof had been wood, replaced by metal sheeting around 1851. By 1973, that metal roof was beyond repair, riddled with holes, and rusted through in many places. The Park Service had to source sheet metal similar to what would have been used in the mid-19th century, shape it to match the original roof profile, and install it using techniques that would be historically appropriate while also meeting modern standards for weatherproofing. The red paint on the roof had to be formulated to match the historical color while using non-toxic pigments, since the original lead-based paint was no longer acceptable for use. Interior restoration was equally complex. The house had been modified repeatedly during its 130 years of use. Walls had been moved, doorways had been added or relocated, windows had been changed. Paint had been applied over paint, layer after layer, sometimes concealing original decorative features. The Park Service team had to carefully remove later additions, expose original surfaces, analyze paint layers to determine what colors had been used in 1853, and replicate those colors using modern paints that would match the historical appearance while being more durable and less toxic than period paints. The wallpaper in some rooms presented particularly difficult research challenges. By studying small fragments of original wallpaper that had survived under baseboards and in corners, conservators could determine patterns and colors. But finding or reproducing those patterns meant tracking down manufacturers who could create custom wallpaper based on 19th century designs. In some cases, wallpaper had to be hand-printed using screens to match the patterns that had been popular in the 1850s. Furnishing the restored house required equal attention to historical accuracy. The Park Service wanted to show what the house would have looked like when Innocent lived there, which meant acquiring or reproducing furniture, household items, church vestments, books, and all the other objects that would have been present. Some original items had survived and were returned to the house. Others had been lost or destroyed and had to be reproduced based on photographs, descriptions in documents, or period-appropriate items from other sources. The chapel required special attention because it was the spiritual heart of the house and because Orthodox liturgical requirements are specific. Icons had to be properly sourced and conserved. Some of the original icons that Innocent had imported from Russia had survived in Alaska's Orthodox churches and were returned to the bishop's house for display. Others had to be created by contemporary iconographers working in traditional styles. Liturgical vessels, vestments, books, all had to be either original or carefully reproduced to maintain the chapel's authenticity as a place where Orthodox worship had been conducted. Throughout the restoration, the Park Service faced a constant tension between historical accuracy and modern requirements. The building needed heating, electricity, plumbing, fire suppression systems, accessibility features for visitors with disabilities, security systems to protect the artifacts, none of which had existed in 1853. Installing these modern systems while keeping them invisible to visitors required creative solutions. Running wiring through existing wall cavities, installing ductwork in spaces that wouldn't be seen, designing lighting fixtures that looked period-appropriate but used modern bulbs, creating wheelchair access that didn't compromise the historical appearance of entrances. The project also required training staff to maintain the building properly once restoration was complete. Wood buildings in Alaska's climate need constant attention. The Park Service rangers and maintenance staff who would be responsible for the bishop's house had to learn about log construction, traditional building techniques, appropriate cleaning and maintenance procedures for historical structures, and how to monitor the building for problems before they became serious. This training was as much a part of the restoration as the physical work on the building. By 1989, when the restoration was finally complete, the Russian bishop's house looked much as it had in the 1850s, at least from a visitor's perspective. The ochre yellow paint was the right shade. The red metal roof matched historical photographs. The interior spaces were arranged as they had been during Innocent's residency. The chapel contained icons similar to ones he would have used. Visitors could walk through the building and get a sense of what life was like for a Russian Orthodox bishop administering a diocese that stretched thousands of miles across the North Pacific. Today, the Russian bishop's house is a museum. Visitors can tour the first floor on their own, examining exhibits about Russian America and the Orthodox Church and the indigenous peoples of Alaska. The second floor, including Innocent's living quarters and the chapel, is accessible through ranger-led tours. The house is part of the larger Sitka National Historical Park, which also includes the site of the 1804 Battle of Sitka and a collection of totem poles. The Park Service presents the house as an example of Russian colonial architecture and as a monument to the work of St. Innocent, who is venerated in the Orthodox Church as the enlightener of the Aleots and apostle to America. Which brings us back to the question from the beginning. What exactly are we preserving when we preserve a building like this? The Park Service interpretation emphasizes Innocent's linguistic work, his translations, his school, his advocacy for indigenous people, his role in spreading Orthodox Christianity in Alaska. All of that is true, but the house also represents an empire built on exploitation. It was paid for by a company that enslaved indigenous hunters and took their families hostage. It served as the administrative center for a church that, whatever its theological commitments, functioned as an arm of colonial administration. The education provided in the school wasn't neutral. It was designed to create subjects of the Russian Empire, to replace indigenous languages and practices with Russian ones, to make colonization appear as salvation. This doesn't mean the house shouldn't be preserved. Historical buildings aren't monuments to perfection. They're monuments to complexity. The bishop's house is valuable precisely because it forces us to grapple with the contradiction of a compassionate individual working within a brutal system. Innocent genuinely cared about the Aleots and the Tlingits and the other peoples he ministered to. He learned their languages and listened to their concerns and documented their suffering. But he also accepted funding from the people causing that suffering and used it to build institutions that furthered Russian control. Both things are true at the same time. The Russian-American company officially dissolved in 1881, 14 years after the sale of Alaska. It had been one of the most powerful corporations in the world during its heyday, with monopolistic control over a territory that would eventually become the largest state in the United States. At its peak, the company had around 800 Russian employees and thousands of indigenous laborers. It generated wealth for shareholders in St. Petersburg and supplied luxury furs to markets in China and Europe. It also presided over one of the most dramatic population collapses in colonial history. The Aleut population, which had been around 17,000 when Russians first arrived, was down to fewer than 3,000 by 1900. Some of that decline was disease, which would have happened regardless of Russian presence. But much of it was the direct result of forced labor, violence, family separation, and the destruction of traditional hunting and subsistence practices. The indigenous peoples of Alaska didn't simply vanish, despite the company's best efforts to work them to death. They adapted. They survived. They incorporated elements of Russian culture, including Orthodox Christianity, into their own traditions. Today, nearly 90 Russian Orthodox parishes operate in Alaska, with a membership of over 20,000 people, most of them Alaska natives. That's a living legacy of Russian colonialism, but it's also a legacy that has been claimed and transformed by the people who experienced the colonization. The Orthodox Church in Alaska isn't a Russian institution anymore. It's an indigenous institution run by and for Alaska natives, with services conducted in native languages alongside Church Slavonic and English. The bishop's house sits in the middle of all this history like a knot that won't untie. You can walk through its carefully restored rooms and admire the craftsmanship, and imagine what it was like to live in Sitka in the 1850s, when Alaska was still Russian and the bishop's house was the most important building in town after the governor's mansion. You can see the icons that Innocent imported from Russia, the religious texts he translated, the simple furniture he used. You can stand in the chapel and feel the weight of all those prayers offered over all those years. But you can't escape the fact that every log in that building, every board, every nail that was added later, was purchased with money earned from the brutalization of indigenous people. The house is beautiful. It's also a crime scene. Perhaps that's the most honest way to think about it. The preservation of the bishop's house isn't about celebrating Russian colonialism or condemning it. It's about refusing to let it disappear. The building is a witness. It's evidence. It's a place where the official history, the treaties and the charters, and the missionary reports meets the lived history of people whose suffering funded the whole operation. Letting it collapse would have been easier in some ways. Easier to avoid the uncomfortable questions. Easier to tell a simpler story about Alaska as purely American, a place that started in 1867 when Seward wrote a check and the flag went up. But history isn't simple. Alaska was inhabited for 10,000 years, before any European arrived. The Russian period, brutal as it was, lasted for 126 years and left marks that still haven't faded. The American period that followed wasn't much better for Alaska natives in many respects. The U.S. military took control of the territory after the purchase and treated indigenous peoples as potential adversaries in the ongoing Indian Wars. Alaska natives weren't granted U.S. citizenship until 1924, and even then, they faced discrimination and the forced assimilation policies that characterized federal Indian policy in that era. Boarding schools, cultural suppression, land theft, all of it continued under American rule. The Bishop's House survived all of it. It survived the transition from Russian to American control. It survived the decline of the fur trade and the collapse of the Russian-American Company. It survived the closure of the church school and the decades of neglect. It survived the catastrophic loss of funding after the Russian Revolution. It survived being abandoned. And now it survives as a museum, carefully maintained by the National Park Service, visited by thousands of tourists each year, most of whom probably don't think too hard about the contradictions built into its walls. There's a kind of violence in preservation, too. When you restore a building to a specific historical moment, you're making choices about what matters and what doesn't. The Park Service chose 1853 because that was when the house was at the height of its function and Innocent was still in residence. But 1853 was also deep in the middle of the fur trade's worst excesses. Sea otter populations were collapsing. Aleut communities were decimated. The Russian-American Company was desperate to maintain profits and pushing harder on its indigenous laborers. Choosing to restore the house to that specific year means presenting it at a moment of maximum hypocrisy, when the gap between the church's professed values and the reality of colonial violence was widest. Maybe that's intentional. Maybe the Park Service is smarter than it seems, and the restoration is meant to make visitors uncomfortable, to create a space where you can't avoid thinking about complicity and systems and the ways that good intentions don't erase harm. Or maybe it's just that 1853 was the year with the best historical documentation and practical considerations trumped symbolism. Either way, the result is the same, a building that won't let you off easy. The story of the Russian Bishop's House is the story of empire in miniature. Empires aren't built by monsters. They're built by ordinary people who convince themselves that what they're doing is necessary, even noble. The merchants who organized the Russian-American Company believed they were extending civilization and commerce to the frontier. The Tsar who granted them a monopoly believed he was securing Russia's place as a great power. The priests and bishops who came to Alaska believed they were saving souls. And maybe they were, in some limited sense. But they were also participating in a system that treated human beings as resources to be exploited until they were used up. Innocent lived long enough to see the end of Russian America. He was Metropolitan of Moscow when Alaska was sold, sitting in the highest ecclesiastical office in the Russian Orthodox Church, far from the place where he'd spent his most productive years. He died in 1879, 12 years after the sale. In his final years, he worked to establish the Orthodox Missionary Society, which continued sending missionaries to Alaska and other parts of the Russian Empire. He never stopped believing in the importance of spreading Orthodox Christianity to indigenous peoples, never stopped believing that conversion was a form of salvation, even though he'd seen firsthand what colonialism did to the people it claimed to save. The question of his legacy is complicated by the fact that he was canonized. Saint Innocent of Alaska is a revered figure in the Orthodox Church, celebrated for his missionary work and his linguistic accomplishments and his compassion. Many Alaska natives venerate him as someone who genuinely cared about their welfare and tried to protect them from the worst abuses of the Russian-American Company. That's not wrong. He did care. He did try. But caring doesn't undo systemic harm, and trying doesn't change the fact that the institution he served benefited from the exploitation he opposed. There's a parallel here to other colonial situations where individual colonizers developed genuine affection for colonized peoples while still upholding the structure of colonialism. Think of British administrators in India who learned Sanskrit and studied Hindu philosophy but never questioned whether Britain had the right to rule India in the first place. Think of French missionaries in Africa who preserved indigenous languages in writing, but only so they could use those languages to spread Christianity and French influence. The personal relationships are real. The affection is real. The harm is also real. All of it exists simultaneously. The bishop's house, in its silence, testifies to all of this. Walk through it now, and you'll see the chapel with its icons, the study where Innocent worked on his translations, the simple rooms where he slept and ate. You'll see exhibits about the Orthodox Church in Alaska, about the construction of the house, about the restoration project. You'll learn that it's one of the oldest buildings in Alaska, a rare example of Russian colonial architecture, a national historic landmark. All of that is true, but it's not the whole truth. The whole truth includes the Finnish carpenters who built the house, brought to Sitka by a company that had no intention of ever paying their passage home. It includes the indigenous children who attended the school, taught to read in Russian and Church Slavonic, but not always in their own languages. It includes the Aleut hunters whose labor paid for the spruce logs and the metal roof and the icons from Russia. It includes the women who were taken hostage, so their husbands and brothers would hunt sea otters until there were almost no sea otters left to hunt. It includes the 80% of the Aleut population who died within 50 years of Russian contact, killed by disease and violence and the systematic destruction of their way of life. And it includes the reality that none of that stopped the bishop's house from being a place where real work happened, where real faith was practiced, where real human connections were made. Innocent baptized thousands of people, and for many of them, that baptism meant something. He translated scripture into languages that had never been written before, and those translations are still used today. He trained indigenous clergy who went on to lead their own communities. He established schools that taught literacy at a time when most of Alaska was still oral culture. He advocated loudly and persistently for better treatment of Alaska Natives, even when it made him unpopular with the Russian-American company officials he depended on for funding. Does the good outweigh the bad? That's not the right question, because it assumes they're on different sides of a scale. They're not. They're tangled together, inseparable. The good was possible because of the bad. The bad was justified by the good. You can't pull them apart without unraveling the whole story. The preservation of the bishop's house forces us to hold that contradiction in our minds. It's a beautiful building. It's a monument to faith and education and cross-cultural exchange. It's also a monument to exploitation and colonialism and the casual violence of empire. Both are true, both matter. Choosing one over the other would be dishonest. So the house stands, ochre yellow with a red roof, on the corner of Lincoln and Monastery Streets in Sitka, Alaska. Fog rolls in from the water. Tourists take photographs, rangers give tours. The icons in the chapel have been cleaned and conserved. The logs are solid again, the rot replaced with new wood. Everything is as it should be, or as close as preservation can make it. But if you stand in the chapel long enough, if you let the silence settle around you, you might start to hear what the house isn't saying. You might hear the voices of the Finnish carpenters who didn't get to go home. You might hear the Aleut children reciting prayers in Russian while their parents were out on the water, hunting otters they would never benefit from. You might hear the bishops discussing mission strategy while company ships loaded with furs prepared to sail for markets where nobody asked how the furs were obtained. You might hear all the things that happened in the shadow of this house, things that weren't recorded in the church registers or mentioned in the official reports, things that were simply the background noise of empire, so ordinary that nobody thought they were worth writing down. Or maybe you won't hear anything. Maybe it's just a museum, carefully maintained, educational and informative, a window into a past that's safely over. Maybe the preservation has worked too well, scrubbing away the ugliness until only the aesthetics remain. Maybe that's what we want from our historical buildings, to admire them without having to feel anything complicated, to learn without having to change. But the past isn't safely over. The Russian Orthodox Church is still active in Alaska, still serving indigenous communities, still grappling with its colonial legacy. Alaska Native peoples are still here, still recovering from centuries of exploitation, still fighting for recognition of their rights and their cultures. The economic systems that extracted wealth from Alaska during the Russian period evolved but didn't disappear. The American period brought new forms of exploitation: gold mining, fishing, oil. The territory became a state in 1959. But that didn't fix the underlying problems of who gets to profit from Alaska's resources and who pays the cost. The bishop's house sits in the middle of all these continuities, a physical reminder that history doesn't end just because we decide it's over. The building has been preserved, but the systems it represented are still operating, just under different names and with different justifications. We've gotten better at telling ourselves stories about why what we're doing is okay, better at creating distance between ourselves and the harm our economic choices cause, better at preserving the beautiful parts of the past while downplaying the ugly parts. But every once in a while, a building like this one refuses to cooperate with our comfortable narratives. It stands there, solid and undeniable, and it makes us ask questions we'd rather not answer. Questions about what we're willing to do for profit. Questions about how we justify causing harm in the service of something we believe is good. Questions about whose stories get preserved and whose get lost. Questions about what it means to celebrate a missionary who opposed violence while accepting money from the people committing it. The Russian bishop's house doesn't answer those questions. It just asks them over and over to everyone who walks through its doors. Some visitors hear the questions, some don't. But the building keeps asking anyway, because that's what monuments do when we let them tell the truth instead of the story we want to hear. In the end, the preservation of the bishop's house is an act of ambivalence. It says, this matters. This building, this history, this moment in time when Russian Alaska was trying to be something more than a fur trading operation and mostly failing, it matters. It deserves to be remembered in all its complexity, with all its contradictions intact. The preservation isn't a celebration. It's not an apology either. It's an acknowledgement that this happened, that it was both better and worse than we'd like to think, and that we owe it to the people who lived through it to not let it be forgotten. The fog in Sitka never really goes away. It just shifts, revealing and concealing in turn. Some days you can see clear across the water to the mountains. Other days you can barely see the end of the block. The bishop's house looks different in different light, sometimes welcoming, sometimes ominous, sometimes just old. But it's always there, solid and ochre yellow, waiting for the next visitor to walk through its doors and try to figure out what it means. That's the work of historical preservation at its best. Not to provide answers, but to create spaces where questions can be asked and where the past is present enough to matter. The bishop's house does that work. It stands as evidence of a moment in American history that most people don't know much about, when Alaska was Russian and empires competed for control of the North Pacific, and indigenous peoples were caught in the middle of forces they couldn't control. It stands as evidence that individuals can be compassionate and complicit at the same time, that good intentions don't erase systemic harm, that history is always more complicated than we want it to be. And it stands as a reminder that preservation is a choice. We chose to save this building when we could have let it collapse. We chose to restore it to a specific moment in time. We chose to make it a museum, to interpret its history in certain ways, to tell certain stories about what it represents. Those choices matter. They shape what we remember and what we forget, what we celebrate and what we condemn, who gets to be a hero, and who gets written out of the narrative entirely. The Russian bishop's house won't let us forget that choices have consequences. The choice to fund the church with money from the fur trade had consequences. The choice to educate indigenous children in Russian Orthodox Christianity had consequences. The choice to build a beautiful building in the middle of a colonial enterprise had consequences. The choice to preserve that building and make it a symbol of cultural exchange had consequences. All of it matters. All of it shapes how we understand Alaska's history and America's history and the long, complicated story of how empires work and what they leave behind. So the house stands. The fog rolls in. The tourists come and go. The rangers tell their stories. The icons watch from the walls of the chapel, silent witnesses to more than a century of prayers and plans and promises and betrayals. And somewhere in the distance, in communities across Alaska, indigenous peoples continue the work of survival and recovery and reclaiming what was taken from them, including, in some cases, the Russian Orthodox faith that was supposed to erase their cultures but instead became part of them. That's the final irony of the bishop's house. It was built to serve an empire that no longer exists. It was meant to be the center of a religious mission that would convert Alaska's indigenous peoples into subjects of the Tsar. Instead, it became a symbol of something more complicated: the persistence of indigenous peoples despite colonialism, the transformation of imposed religion into indigenous practice, the stubborn refusal of history to be simple or convenient or finished. The preservation of the building acknowledges all of that, whether the Park Service intended it or not. By saving the Bishop's House, by restoring it and opening it to the public and interpreting its history, we're making a statement about what deserves to be remembered. We're saying that this matters, not just the beautiful parts, not just the stories of individual heroism, but all of it, the whole messy, violent, contradictory reality of colonialism and faith and survival. That's worth doing. That's worth the 16 years of restoration, the ongoing maintenance, the careful interpretation, the difficult questions. Because if we can't look honestly at our history, if we can't hold the beauty and the horror in our minds at the same time, if we can't acknowledge that people like Innocent were both compassionate and complicit, then we're not really learning from the past. We're just using it to make ourselves feel better. The Russian Bishop's House won't let us feel better. It sits there, solid and ochre yellow and impossible to ignore, asking questions that don't have easy answers. That's what makes it worth preserving. That's what makes it more than just another old building. It's a monument to complexity, to the contradictions at the heart of empire, to the tangled relationship between faith and power, and exploitation and survival. And on foggy mornings in Sitka, when the light is right and the tourists haven't arrived yet, you can stand in front of the Bishop's House and almost see all of it at once. The beauty and the blood, the prayers and the pelts, the salvation and the slavery, the empire that was and the peoples who remain. You can see why the building had to be saved and why it will never be comfortable to look at. You can see why history matters and why it hurts. That's the work. That's the inheritance. That's what the preservation of the Russian Bishop's House gives us. Not comfort, not pride, but the truth. As close as we can get to it, as honest as we can make it. The building stands, the fog rolls in, the story continues.